In late 1927, State Street in Chicago didn't just look like a crime scene, it looked like a war zone. Glass rained onto the sidewalk, shattering over the heads of screaming pedestrians, while a stunned firefighter stepped over a crushed fedora covered in gray dust. When the smoke finally cleared, it revealed a crater where a popular storefront had stood only minutes before. Police immediately told the press it was a gas leak, and the crowd believed it was a tragic accident. But then the camera pans to a black armored Cadillac rolling slowly past the chaos, tinted windows rolled tight. Inside the car, a massive hand smooths out a wrinkled ivory napkin on a trembling knee. Al Capone earned $100 million a year, but today wasn't about business. It was an emotional receipt for 3 words spoken 2 days earlier. The detonator wasn't a fuse, it was a sentence. By the winter of 1927, Al Capone wasn't just a gangster. He was a municipal utility. Operating out of the Metropole Hotel, he occupied a suite that cost $1,500 a day, protected by an army of gunmen and a mayor named Big Bill Thompson, who was comfortably deep in his pocket. The public saw the flashbulbs and the soup kitchens, but those who walked the halls of the Metropole knew the air pressure was different inside. Visitors described walking past literal stacks of cash used as doorstops, bills fluttering in the drafty hallways like discarded trash. But real power, as Capone often muttered to his tailor, isn't about the money you can spend. It's about the insults you don't have to hear. The King of Chicago had a weakness that no amount of armored plating could cover. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the IRS. At least, not yet. It was his vanity. He hated the nickname Scarface, violently correcting anyone who dared use it, insisting on snorky, a slang term for a sharp dresser. He wore custom suits to hide his girth and powdered his face to hide the scars. His empire was built on fear, but his ego was built on a fragile, desperate need for respect. "You treat a man like a man. He acts like a man," he once said. But the inverse was also true. If you treated Al Capone like a joke, you didn't just get a bullet. You got erased. People close to the outfit knew the tension was building. The silence in the Metropole elevators was heavier than usual. The problem wasn't a shortage of whiskey or a crackdown on gambling. The problem was a persistent, gnawing disrespect coming from the North Side. There was a sense that the peace treaties of 1926 were fraying, not because of territory disputes, but because of personal animosity. The city felt stable, but under the surface the fault lines were trembling. All it would take was one slip, one comment, one moment of arrogance to turn the Cold War hot. And that moment was already waiting on a table across town, resting under a wine glass. The friction originated from Joseph Aiello, a man who didn't want to be a partner. He wanted to be the king. Aiello ran the Unione Siciliana, and his hatred for Capone was biological, deep-rooted in the old-world politics of Sicily versus Naples. Aiello controlled the North Side, using a bakery and a restaurant as his primary fronts, places where the smell of yeast usually covered the smell of gunpowder. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a businessman who felt he had been passed over by history. He viewed Capone as a brute, a pretender, a nobody who had lucked into an empire he wasn't bred to run. It was in the back room of his bakery, shielded from the street by heavy velvet curtains, where the truce finally died. The date is fuzzy in the police files, but the legendary account places it on a rainy Tuesday. Aiello was drinking with 3 associates, discussing the impossible grip Capone held on City Hall. The frustration boiled over. He stood up, spilling cheap Chianti onto the tablecloth, and shouted the words that would cost him his sanctuary. "That fat Italian!" he roared, laughing at his own bravery. "He's a beast. He belongs in a zoo, not a hotel." The room laughed with him. It felt safe. It felt private. But in the corner, clearing a tray of empty glasses, was a busboy whose face nobody remembered. He moved like a shadow, efficient and invisible. As Aiello ranted, wiping his mouth, he tossed a dirty ivory napkin onto the table. The busboy picked it up. He didn't just see a piece of linen, he saw a golden ticket. He slipped the napkin, still stained with the wine of the man who signed his paychecks, into his pocket. He didn't clock out. He walked straight out the back door, into the alley, and started running toward the south side. The call didn't go directly to Capone. You couldn't just ring the king. The intel traveled up a verified chain of command, moving from a payphone in a pharmacy on Michigan Avenue to a driver, then to a lieutenant. It was raining that night, a cold Chicago sleet that froze on the pavement. The busboy, breathless and soaked, handed over the napkin as proof of his proximity, reciting the insult verbatim. The lieutenant made the final call from the lobby of the Metropole. He didn't whisper. He didn't use code. He repeated the slur exactly as it was said. Fat Italian. Zoo animal. Upstairs, in the suite that cost more than most Americans made in a decade, Al Capone took the receiver. Witnesses say the room went terrifyingly quiet. Usually, Capone was volcanic, shouting, throwing objects, demanding immediate retribution. But this time, he sat perfectly still. The vanity that drove him to wear imported silk and powder his scars had been punctured. It wasn't about business territory anymore. It was about identity. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened window, the rain streaking the glass like tears on the city's face. "Do you want him hit?" the lieutenant asked, hand hovering over his holster. Capone didn't answer immediately. A hit was too quick. A hit was what you did to a traitor or a thief. For an insult of this magnitude, for calling the king of Chicago a fat Italian in front of his own men, death wasn't enough. The punishment had to be biblical. It had to be structural. Capone finally spoke, his voice dropping an octave, calm and detached. "No guns," he said, turning back to his cigar. "I don't want to kill him. I want to renovate him." The hunt began the next morning, but it didn't look like a gang war. In the basement of a shell company near the Loop, Capone's best soldiers weren't cleaning Thompson submachine guns or sawing off shotguns. They were huddled around a large wooden table staring at building blueprints. The frantic energy of a hit squad was replaced by the cold calculation of demolition experts. They studied the architectural layout of Aiello's restaurant and bakery complex, the load-bearing walls, the basement access, the street drainage. The man leading the meeting wasn't a hitman. He was an engineer on the payroll of the mob. Across town, Joseph Aiello sensed the shift in the wind. The streets felt too quiet. He knew his words might have leaked, so he fortified his position. He doubled the armed guards at the front entrance of his bakery and stationed men on the roof with rifles. He created a fortress, expecting a drive-by shooting or a classic raid. He assumed the attack would come from the street, loud and aggressive, the Chicago way. This was his fatal error. False certainty. He was watching the horizon while the enemy was looking at the floorboards. Inside the safe house, the plan solidified. A standard bomb would just blow out the windows. They didn't want broken glass. They wanted erasure. The engineer pointed to a structural weakness in the blueprint, a shared wall with the shop next door that was currently vacant. "If you hit it here," he told the crew, tracing a line with a grease pencil, The whole front comes down. Beside the blueprints lay a coiled roll of fuse wire and a singular object that looked out of place, a stack of what appeared to be flour sacks. They weren't baking bread. They were baking a disaster. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in patience. Capone's spotter, a man known only as Blinky in the police files, parked a nondescript delivery truck across the street from Aiello's stronghold. He wasn't there to shoot. He was there to clock habits. He watched the rhythm of the restaurant. When did the customers leave? When did the kitchen staff go out for smoke breaks? When was the alley clear of deliveries? He held a stopwatch, clicking it every time the back door swung open, building a temporal map of Aiello's vulnerability. At the Metropole, Capone was visibly public, ensuring his alibi was as solid as concrete. He sat in the lobby playing pinochle with journalists and politicians, laughing loudly, ordering rounds of drinks for the house. He made sure to be seen, touched, and heard. "Business is good," he told a reporter from the Tribune, smiling that famous, dangerous smile. "We're expanding." He checked his watch constantly, not because he was bored, but because he knew Blinky was syncing his movements to the minute. The duality was absolute. The genial host upstairs, the mechanic of death downstairs. Back on the street, the spotter noticed the pattern. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the alley behind the bakery was dead silent. The guards at the front door were vigilant, checking every car that slowed down, but the back was neglected. It was a blind spot born of arrogance. Aiello didn't think anyone would dare approach him from the rear. "Make sure it's loud," Capone had reportedly told the team. The instruction wasn't about decibels, it was about the message. It had to be loud enough to drown out the insult. The delivery happened under the cover of a routine supply run. At 3:15 a.m., a truck rattled down the service alley, splashing through puddles. To any observer, it looked like a standard flour delivery for the bakery's morning shift. The men jumping out of the back were dressed in white coveralls, covered in dusting powder, carrying heavy burlap sacks on their shoulders. They walked right past a sleepy lookout who nodded at them, assuming they were bakers arriving early to start the dough. The twist was ordinary: invisibility through labor. No one looks twice at a man doing a job he's supposed to do. Inside those burlap sacks, packed tight within layers of actual flour, were customized casings filled with high-grade dynamite. Dynamite was common in the Chicago gang wars. Pineapples, hand grenades, were thrown daily, but precision explosives were rare. This wasn't a crude toss. This was a surgical implant. The men in white coveralls moved quickly, stacking the sacks against the shared wall identified in the blueprints. They weren't guessing. They were following the engineer's grease pencil line to the millimeter. Context is everything in 1927. The city was used to violence, but it was usually impulsive. A drive-by was messy. Bullets went everywhere. This approach was chillingly calm. The assassins stacked the explosives with the care of masons laying bricks. They connected the wiring, checking the contacts twice. One of them, according to legend, dusted his hands off on his coveralls, leaving white powder prints in the dark air. They weren't leaving a bomb. They were leaving a tombstone. They slipped back into the truck and vanished, leaving behind nothing but the smell of damp earth and the ticking clock of chemical reactions. Rumors move faster than electricity in the underworld. Just hours before the detonation, whispers began to circulate in the underground speakeasies on the neutral ground of the Loop. A corrupt detective, playing both sides of the fence, allegedly made a frantic phone call to Aiello's establishment. "Get out," he warned. "The big guy knows." This was the moment where history could have pivoted. If Aiello had run, if he had abandoned the property, the story ends differently. But here, a second player entered the game. Pride. Aiello stood in his office, the receiver in his hand. He looked around his kingdom, the velvet curtains, the imported wood bar, the empire he had built to challenge Capone. To run now would be to admit the fat Italian had won without firing a shot. He slammed the phone down. He was trapped by his own ego. He pulled an ivory napkin from his desk drawer, identical to the one the busboy had stolen, and wiped a layer of cold sweat from his upper lip. "Let them come," he told his bodyguard. "I'm not leaving my house." Needle lines in history are often spoken by men who are about to lose everything. Aiello believed the threat was a raid. He believed he could shoot his way out. He checked his pistol, unaware that a gun is useless against physics. He poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly, the ice clinking against the glass. He was playing checkers while Capone was playing geological warfare. He stayed put, anchored by a fatal misunderstanding of his enemy. Pride doesn't just go before a fall. Sometimes it goes before a detonation. 0 hour arrived with the smell of morning coffee and stale cigarettes. Inside the bakery complex, the staff was beginning the opening routine. A janitor mopped the checkered floor, whistling a low tune. The guards at the front were shifting shift, tired and eyeing the sunrise. Deep in the basement structure, near the party wall, the chemical reaction reached its flashpoint. The fuse had been burning silently for 20 minutes, a glowing red worm eating its way through the darkness, past the wine cellar, up the support beams. The atmosphere was heavy, loaded with static. A sous chef paused mid-step, sniffing the air. He smelled sulfur mixed with the yeast, a wrong metallic scent that prickled the hairs on his arms. He frowned, looking toward the back wall. "Gas?" he whispered to the dishwasher. It was the last word spoken in the old world. The silence that followed was sucked out of the room as the air compressed, a vacuum forming right before the release. You assume you know what an explosion feels like from movies, but the reality is less visual and more visceral. The pressure wave moves faster than the sound. The timeline of the restaurant, the bakery, and everyone inside it had reached its final punctuation mark. The spark hit the first sack of flour. The casing disintegrated. The load-bearing wall, the one identified on the blueprints, ceased to exist as a solid object. The ground shattered before the sound actually hit the eardrums of the people on State Street. It started as a vibration in the soles of their shoes, a sickening lurch of the concrete. Then came the roar. It was a sound so loud it didn't register as noise. It registered as pain. 2 blocks away, a coffee cup vibrating on a diner table slid 3 inches before vibrating off the edge and smashing. This wasn't a pop. It was a thunderclap birthed from the pavement. The scale of the destruction was theatrical. The entire front facade of Aiello's business blew outward into the street. Windows shattered for 3 blocks in every direction. The blast wave lifted cars onto the sidewalk and turned wooden signs into shrapnel. A cloud of debris, pulverized brick, and timber rose 10 stories high, choking the morning light. The iconic thumbnail moment was the dust settling, a gray, ghostly layer coating the entire block, silencing the screams for a heartbeat. When the dust cleared, the discovery was terrifying. The building was gutted. It looked like a hollow tooth. Miraculously, or perhaps intentionally, fatalities were low. Aiello wasn't inside the main blast zone. He had left the room minutes earlier, or had been shielded by a heavy oak bar, depending on which version of the legend you trust. But the physical man didn't matter. The message was etched in the rubble. It wasn't about killing Aiello. It was about erasing his name from the street. Capone had turned his rival's castle into a sandbox. Police swarmed the scene within minutes, bells clanging, horses skittish on the glass-strewn pavement. Fire trucks hooked up to hydrants, spraying water on the smoldering skeleton of the bakery. Detective squads picked through the wreckage, finding the twisted remains of the furniture and the signs. They found traces of the dynamite, enough to bring down a bridge. The sergeant in charge looked at the crater and knew this wasn't an accident. This was an eviction notice. While the city panicked, Al Capone was confirmed to be in a barber chair at the Metropole miles away, getting a hot towel shave. The perfect alibi. Witnesses placed him there all morning. When the newsboy burst in shouting about the gang war explosion, Capone didn't jump. He didn't ask who. He just gestured for the barber to continue. He lay back, the hot steam rising from the towel, darkness covering his eyes. "Terrible thing," he was heard saying later that afternoon, adjusting his cuffs. "This city is getting dangerous." The audacity was part of the weapon. He controlled the narrative because he controlled the fear. By not hiding, by letting the world see him relaxed while his enemy's world burned, he projected absolute invulnerability. The police knew who did it. Aiello knew who did it. The entire city knew. But knowing and proving were two very different things in 1927. The headlines the next morning screamed in bold block letters, "Gang war explodes." The public reaction was a mixture of horror and perverse admiration. They realized the rules had changed. You couldn't just have guards anymore. You had to watch the walls themselves. Joseph Aiello was physically alive, but spiritually, he was a ghost. He stood on the sidewalk, looking at the pile of bricks that used to be his kingdom. He was humiliated. He was homeless in his own city. The cost was absolute. Aiello went into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, his power broken by the weight of the rubble. He would eventually be gunned down in 1930, but he died the day the bomb went off. He realized too late that you can rebuild a building, but you can't rebuild respect. The explosion stripped him of his aura. To his men, he wasn't a boss anymore. He was a target that attracted high explosives. They drifted away, back to the south side, back to the winter. That night, in a private back room at the Metropole, there were no cheers. The bomber, the engineer who had drawn the grease line, sat across from Capone. There was no wild celebration, just business. An envelope thick with bills slid across the mahogany table. It stopped right at the edge. The debt was paid. Capone picked up his fork for dinner. He tucked a fresh, crisp ivory napkin into his collar, smoothing it over his chest. It was the same motion, the same object, but the meaning had shifted. It was no longer a tool of espionage. It was a symbol of cleanliness, of order restored. "The soup," he commanded, looking at the waiter. "And make sure it's hot." It wasn't hate that drove him. It was brand management. He had protected the trademark of his reputation with dynamite. Years later, in the late 1940s, the king was in decline. Al Capone sat in a garden in Florida, his mind ravaged by untreated syphilis, his power a distant memory. The millions were gone or hidden. The empire had crumbled. He sat in a wheelchair, trembling, watching the wind move the palm trees. He fumbled in his lap with a piece of cloth, an ivory napkin. His fingers, once powerful enough to order the destruction of a city block, now struggled to fold the linen. He didn't remember the explosion. He didn't remember Joseph Aiello or the fat Italian slur. He just stared at the white cloth, confused. The napkin had survived longer than his mind. He spent millions to make the world respect his name, only to forget it himself.